In 2009, I published with the press of that certain other university a very short introduction to ancient Greece, subtitled A History in 11 Cities. Now, the point of the subtitle was to inform or remind readers that there were more than just 2 ancient Greek cities. Actually, there was something like 1,000 separate Hellenic political entities at most times between about, say, 600 and 300 BC. And yet more were generated by the spread of Hellenism in the wake of Alexander the Great's Persian adventure of the 330s and 320s, including not least a certain Alexandria in Egypt, the ancient Greco-Roman world's cultural capital before Rome and then Constantinople. It's thanks to that foundation of Alexander the Great, ultimately, that I and my fellow classicist colleagues are in a position to do what we do. To put it aphoristically, without ancient Alexandria's scholarship, there would be no modern discipline or profession of classics, which is why I devoted my 2010 Nabendis lecture in Nicosia, Lefkosia, precisely to Alexandria and its cultural legacy. However, although there were over 1,000 separate ancient Greek political entities, really there are only 2 of them that we can say a great deal about in any depth. And those just happen to be the 2 to which I've been devoting most of my attention over the past 5 years, and will be devoting most of my attention over the next 5 years, respectively Athens and Sparta. Winston Churchill, in 1939, was convinced that, I quote, "with adequate leadership, democracy can be a more efficient form of government than fascism." That was in an interview published in the New Statesman. After the Second World War, he rather more famously opined that democracy was the worst form of government apart from all the rest. And it's one of the many paradoxes of our current adulation of, or is it merely lip service to, democracy, which is often, and I believe rightly, held to be an ancient Greek invention. It's one of the ironies that in antiquity, democracy as a state form or mode of self-governance was actually largely derided and reviled by articulate, sometimes brilliant critics such as Plato and Aristotle. And it continued to be abused all the way down to the very end of the 18th century, if not well into the 19th. Whereafter, quite suddenly, from the second quarter of the 19th century onwards, democracy, the word, began its remarkable upwards evaluative trajectory until we are all Democrats now, or at least we are, if we live in the liberal bourgeois late capitalist West. How come? Well, that was one of the questions I set myself to address in a course of 24 Part 2, that is final year, undergraduate lectures, delivered jointly to students reading for both the classical and the historical triposits. And that course went from 2009 to 2013. Part of the answer, or a partial answer, is that democracy today, modern, post-1850 democracy, is very unlike, and sometimes indeed the diametrical opposite of what any self-respecting ancient Greek, whatever his ideology, would have counted or recognized as Demokratia. At any rate, as that word was understood when it was coined, and when institutions referred to as Demokratia were first put into practice. For the ancient abstract noun Demokratia is a portmanteau word compounded of demos and kratos, the first element of which is ambiguous and ambivalent, but the second is emphatically not. Demos seems ultimately to have meant something like village or local community. A sense is indeed retained, even after it had come to acquire its far more potentially explosive and more precisely political meaning of people. People, as we know from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address of 1863, can be a usefully vague term. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. But which people exactly are we talking about? Put it another way, since kratos in ancient Greek means power, and is derived etymologically from the Greek verb meaning to grasp or to grip, which people was it that had its or their hands on the levers of political power? Or to put that personally, as the ancient Greeks more often did and thought, they didn't say Athens did this or that, they said the Athenians did this or that. Which people, or what element of the people, controlled, had power over what or whom? The least offensive and most inclusive cashing out of Demokratia held that, and I'm just going to use the Athenians as my example, the demos, or people of the Athenians, controlled the public organs of state, what they called ta pragmata, literally the things. And that was a neutral and descriptive term. However, there was also available a highly offensive and very exclusive construction of the term Demokratia. And for this construction, there exists a good English translation, or at any rate, version. Good because it conveys well the illocutionary and perlocutionary force of the term. These are terms I learned from my philosophy tutor, who happens to be sitting in the audience today. Namely, and this is the translation or version, dictatorship of the proletariat. For demos, in its ancient class sense, meant the masses, the poor, the non-elite majority of the politi, or adult male citizen people. And if you happened not to be a member of that group or section of society, if you were one of the few, the elite rich few, if you were or would like to be an oligarch, then for you, the kratos that the demos exercised might well be seen as being exercised over and against you, rather than for you, and exercised in the selfish sectional interests of the poor masses, rather than for the unsullied good of the community as a whole. Moreover, what would have made matters practically as well as ideologically worse in the eyes of such oligarchic people, government, in the sense of day-to-day governance in an ancient Greek democratic political community, was also by and large and decisively done by the poor majority of the people, the masses. Small wonder, therefore, that the so-called democratic tradition in articulate, written Western political thought has been very largely, if not overwhelmingly, an anti-democratic tradition. Now, I used the ancient Athenians as my illustration for several reasons, but principally because I believe it was they who invented the state form, as it was almost certainly an Athenian or group of Athenians who also coined the word Demokratia, possibly indeed originally as a term of contempt and abuse. So, when modern political commentators, as opposed to specialist ancient historians, claim that the ancient Greeks, or more specifically the ancient Athenians, invented democracy, they're not wrong, but the claim desperately needs to be unpacked a whole lot more if the true significance of that invention is to be fully and properly grasped. But there is more, and again I would want to stress difference rather than similarity between them and us, the contrast between their political world and ours. The Athenians were one of perhaps, as I said, 1,000 or so Greek political communities at the relevant time, late 6th to the late 4th centuries BC or BCE. And by the middle of the 4th century BC, in the 350s or so, within the lifetimes of Plato and Aristotle, perhaps as many as several hundred of that 1,000 were experiencing then, or had experienced, some form of Demokratia, as that term was anciently understood. Now, I stress some form. Aristotle, before he was a political theorist, was a natural scientist. I thought this would go down well in this particular company. A taxonomer and analyst of natural forms, with a special interest in zoology and biology. His dad was a doctor. In his Lyceum, that's his research institute lecture course on politics, matters related to the polis, he applied this taxonomical scientific mindset to his classification and analysis of Greek political institutions and behavior. Specifically, he argued, as a working hypothesis, that there was no such single animal as Demokratia, but rather that Demokratia was a genus of which there were 4 distinct subspecies, a genus of citizen self-rule. Thus, the Athenians did arguably invent and practice Demokratia, but the Demokratia they invented in 508 to 7 BC was qualitatively as well as quantitatively different from that ushered in by the reforms of 462 to 1, and that form, which itself underwent significant modifications during the 60 or so years of its life, was different again, if in more subtle ways, from the Demokratia that had to be restored in 403 after its violent suppressions by its both internal and external enemies between 411 and 404. So the ancient Athenians had at least 3 democracies, possibly even more. It was indeed the ancient Greeks, and specifically the ancient Athenian Greeks, who first invented democracy, both the word and the thing, and various forms of it, in the strong sense of popular power, implying strong notions of political freedom and citizen equality. There are quite simply no possible rival claimants for being the boldly experimental pioneers of this deeply original and massively challenging political art form. All this and much more will be revealed in a forthcoming book, based on that Part 2 lecture course I mentioned, of the course being called Ancient Greek Democracy and Its Legacies. So too, my next book after that will be produced by the press of Oxford University. But whereas in the democracy book I shall be flying solo, the next but one book will be a co-production with an American colleague. And this will be but one of a whole series, almost a phalanx, of studies on the history and archaeology, the archaeohistory of the archaic, that is pre-classical, Greek world, roughly 800 to 500 BCE. As any serious historian of ancient Sparta quickly realizes, studying the written as opposed to material cultural evidence necessarily involves tackling what's been called variously the Spartan tradition, legend, myth, or mirage. That is, getting to grips with the fact that ancient Sparta has been handed down to us in written terms almost exclusively by non-Spartans, often writers with an Athenocentric perspective or agenda, and writing in a thoroughly biased, interested, or slanted way, usually either wildly too favourable or wildly too hostile. Churchill, him again, once likened Soviet Russia to a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. That will do quite well as an analogy for the way in which many, if not most, of the Greeks and Romans writing about ancient Sparta saw their subject matter. The ancient Athenian historian Thucydides, for example, still the subject of much brilliant research here in Cambridge and elsewhere, spoke of the secretiveness of their political system, or he might have said their way of life. Pretty clearly, he wasn't at all enamoured of what little he managed to find out about it. On the other hand, there were those, such as the Athenian philosophers, Plato and Xenophon, and possibly even our friend here, who, in their very different ways, claimed to discover exceptional, if not unique, virtue in at least certain aspects of the Spartan system, such as its public and communal educational program for the young, though not necessarily in every aspect of the system as a whole and as such. Aristotle, interestingly enough, though a pupil of Plato, he and his pupils devoted an entire work to the Spartans' polity. They found almost nothing to praise and a very great deal to blame there, not least the social and economic and even political status of the Spartan citizen women. The modern world, by which I mean from the 18th century on, has followed suit in its contradictory reception of Sparta. On one side, we find Voltaire and liberal Democrats, I mean Democrats who are liberal-minded, united in their excoriation of Sparta's anti-commercial, illiberal, even racist society. On the other side, we find both Rousseau and Nazi German ideologues alike praising Sparta for its minute hierarchy, its devotion to certain ideals of communal virtue, and its ironclad military-style discipline. But it's, of course, the latter, the Nazis, who've had the most impact, and I would say done the most damage to the reputation of my fellow citizens, the Spartans, as that reputation stands today. When I was awarded the honorary citizenship of modern Sparti, I felt obliged to begin my acceptance speech in 2005 with a reference to the dark side of the Spartan legend, that is, to its peculiarly strong appeal to and invocation by fascists, Nazis, and other anti-democrats of varying stripes. As it happens, in all my years at Cambridge, I have had just one graduate pupil who has chosen a Spartan doctoral subject. Thank goodness she happened to be exceptionally brilliant. Tellingly, what she studied was not ancient Sparta as such, but its reception in Germany in the 19th and 20th centuries in elite, second-level pedagogical and military institutions. All history, it's been plausibly claimed on purely intellectual grounds, is in some sense contemporary history. Sometimes, very sadly, that is also the case in terms of ideological appropriation of the past. The rally held last year by the Greek neo-fascist party Golden Dawn, actually at Thermopylae for hot games, the pass where the Spartans and their Greek allies vainly but heroically resisted a Persian-led onslaught in 480 BC. That was a peculiarly uncomfortable reminder of that enduring fact of human society and social memory. Only slightly more palatable, I suspect, will be the imminently forthcoming sequel to the movie 300, which was an implausibly popular cartoon movie about the Battle of Thermopylae. The imaginatively named 300 Rise of an Empire is slated to hit our screens on March the 7th, but I'm not holding my breath to learn whether the Orientalism, or should that be the more or less blatant racism of the original, is toned down or eliminated in the sequel. In any case, I've made sure to get my retaliation in first, because I published last year a study of the Battle of Plataea that took place in 479 BC, the year after Thermopylae, and that was the title of the book, After Thermopylae, and more especially of that decisive and particularly Spartan victory and the way in which it was competitively memorialized, the competitors being, predictably enough, Sparta and Athens. That book was launched in New York in June last year at the Morgan Library and Museum in the shape not just of a talk by me, but a trans-historical, cross-cultural panel discussion about how wars, especially, of course, major, big world wars, ought or ought not to be celebrated and or commemorated. A discussion perhaps not without point or relevance in this centenary year of 2014. All history, as I mentioned, is in some important sense contemporary history. At all events, it will be a nice change for me in the years to come to turn away from the ancient, modern and contemporary receptions of ancient Sparta to studying ancient Sparta itself again in the archaic period, which I shall be doing as one of the two principal investigators of a multi-author, multi-country, interdisciplinary project on the archaeohistory of the ancient Greek world between about 800 and 500 BC. This is a project co-directed by myself and another Paul, Professor Paul Christensen of Dartmouth College in the States. The first two volumes projected in the series will be by the two of us jointly, Sparta, and by Cambridge's current Professor of Ancient History, Robin Osborne. He will be doing Athens. The idea being that we three will, between us, set a kind of template for the other 25 plus studies of cities and regions of archaic Hellas. The other Paul and I will be investigating Sparta's rather complicated settlement history from about 750 BC onwards. We will divide the archaic period into early, middle and late phases, all somewhat arbitrary. We shall then focus in turn on archaic Sparta's political, diplomatic, legal, economic, familial/demographic and cultural history, before looking finally at this extraordinary city's remarkable social and religious customs and institutions. September the 30th, 2014 may be the terminal date of my Levendi's professorship, but it is just the end of the beginning, so far as my own historiae, researches, the nod to Herodotus, are concerned. I should like to end my own shtick with a couple of suitably ancient and modern Greek reflections as I prepare to embark upon the odyssey of retirement. My first reflection is taken, of course, from the original Odyssey, a huge epic poem credited in antiquity to one Homer, and one of the more important reasons I like to think why I'm standing here before you now. It was reading a told to the children version of the Odyssey, illustrated by William Heath Robinson, when I was nobbut a lad of 8, that first my passion for ancient Greek culture was fired. In Book 6 of the Odyssey, the eponymous hero is in a sorry condition indeed. 10 years on from the fall of Troy that he had himself engineered, thanks to his metis, his cunning intelligence, but by now bereft of all his erstwhile comrades, thanks to the anger of hyper-powerful, immortal gods, he is cast up on the island of Scherie, the never-never utopia of the Phaeacians, where he's found in a state of déshabille and of some initial consternation by young Princess Nausicaa. But silver-tongued Odysseus soon recovers his composure, if not yet his clothes. And among much else, he addresses to white-armed Nausicaa the following winged words in the 2012 translation by my Clare classicist colleague Charlie Weiss. May the gods give you all you want and nothing less, a husband and a home, and may they grant the two of you the blessing of unanimity. Nothing is better, nothing finer than when a husband and a wife who think alike share a home. Oh, hear, hear. My second reflection is drawn from one corner of the Odyssey's enormous foreign field of reception. The Alexandrian Greek Constantine Kavafis' 1911 poem Ithaca. In the English translation that I prefer, there are many on the market, and it's that of Evangelos Sakperoglu. Always keep Ithaca in your mind. To arrive there is your final destination. But do not rush the voyage in the least. Better it last for many years, and once you're old, cast anchor on the isle, rich with all you've gained along the way. Then comes the characteristic Cavafi bathos, or decrescendo, expecting not that Ithaca will give you wealth. Ithaca gave you the wondrous voyage. Without her, you'd never have set out, but she has nothing to give you anymore. If then you find her poor, Ithaca has not deceived you. As wise as you've become, with such experience, by now you will have come to know what these Ithacas really mean. Thank you for listening.